Marcus had always been drawn to abandoned places, but the Blackwood Psychiatric Hospital held a particular fascination for him. The massive Victorian structure had been closed for 30 years, its patients relocated when budget cuts forced the state to shut down the facility. Now it stood like a monument to forgotten suffering, its broken windows staring out at the world like hollow eyes. As a photographer specializing in urban exploration, Marcus knew this place would be perfect for his next portfolio. The morning mist clung to the building's facade as he approached, his camera bag slung over his shoulder, excitement coursing through his veins. He had researched the hospital extensively, reading old newspaper articles about the experimental treatments conducted there in the 50s and 60s. Dr. Heinrich Voss, the former chief psychiatrist, had been particularly controversial, pioneering techniques that bordered on torture according to some accounts. The locals still whispered stories about screams echoing from the building, even after it had been abandoned, but Marcus dismissed these as typical small-town folklore. He was a man of science, of art, of rational thought. Ghosts were for the superstitious, not for someone who captured reality through his lens. The front doors had been chained shut for decades, but Marcus had found an old service entrance around back that had been forgotten by whatever security company was supposed to be monitoring the property. The lock had rusted through years ago, and the door creaked open with surprising ease. The smell hit him immediately, a mixture of mold, decay, and something else he couldn't quite identify. It was sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Marcus pulled his jacket up over his nose and stepped inside, his footsteps echoing through the empty corridor. The interior was a photographer's dream. Peeling paint curled from the walls like dead skin, and shafts of dusty sunlight streamed through broken windows, creating dramatic lighting that would make any urban explorer weep with joy. He began shooting immediately, capturing the way shadows played across abandoned gurneys and the haunting beauty of nature, reclaiming the man-made structure. Vines had grown through cracks in the walls, and small trees sprouted from what had once been the reception desk. His camera clicked rhythmically as he moved deeper into the building, each shot carefully composed to capture the melancholy atmosphere of the forgotten place. The psychiatric wing was located on the 3rd floor, and Marcus climbed the deteriorating staircase with careful steps, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The handrail was slick with moisture and something that might have been algae, leaving a greenish residue on his palm. As he reached the 3rd floor landing, he noticed that the air seemed thicker here, more oppressive. The sweet smell from downstairs had intensified, and underneath it was another odor, something medicinal and sharp that made his eyes water. The hallway stretched before him, lined with doors that hung open at odd angles, revealing glimpses of the rooms beyond. Patient rooms, he realized, noting the heavy locks on the outside of each door and the small windows set at eye level. These were isolation cells, places where the most troubled patients had been kept. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, but he attributed it to the cool air and his own overactive imagination. He raised his camera and began documenting the hallway, the play of light and shadow creating an almost ethereal quality in his viewfinder. As he worked his way down the corridor, pausing to photograph particularly interesting details, he began to notice something odd. In several of his shots, there seemed to be a figure in the background, just barely visible in the shadows. At first he thought it might be his own reflection caught in a broken mirror or window, but when he looked through the viewfinder again, there was nothing there. Marcus lowered his camera and squinted down the hallway, but saw only the same empty corridor he had been photographing. He shrugged and continued shooting, chalking it up to his eyes playing tricks on him in the dim light. The human mind was prone to seeing patterns where none existed, especially in environments like this where the atmosphere was already charged with expectation and unease. Room 237 drew his attention immediately. Unlike the others, its door was firmly closed, and when he tried the handle he found it locked. This was unusual, as most of the doors in the facility had been left open when it was abandoned. Marcus pulled out his small toolkit and worked on the lock, his fingers remembering the skills he had learned during his more adventurous youth. The mechanism was old but well made, and after several minutes of careful manipulation, he heard the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place. The door swung open with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo through the entire building. The room beyond was different from the others he had seen. While most of the patient rooms were bare and stripped of anything potentially dangerous, this one still contained furniture. A metal bed frame sat against one wall, its mattress long since rotted away to reveal rusted springs. A small desk and chair occupied the opposite corner, and the walls were covered with what appeared to be writing. Marcus stepped closer, raising his camera to photograph the wall markings, and realized they weren't written in any language he recognized. The symbols were carved deep into the plaster, as if someone had used their fingernails or perhaps a makeshift tool to scratch them there. Some appeared to be letters from various alphabets. Others looked like crude pictographs or mathematical equations. The sheer volume of writing was staggering, covering every available surface from floor to ceiling. As Marcus photographed the walls, he began to notice a pattern in the carvings. Certain symbols repeated frequently, and there seemed to be a progression from simple marks near the door to increasingly complex designs as they moved toward the far wall. The final section, around the area where the bed had been positioned, contained the most elaborate carvings. These were deeper than the others, cut so far into the plaster that they had reached the brick underneath. Dark stains surrounded some of the deeper carvings, stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he documented these markings. This was exactly the kind of discovery that would make his career, evidence of the human drama that had played out in these abandoned spaces. He could already envision the gallery showing, the way these photographs would capture the raw emotion and desperation of whoever had been confined in this room. The story would write itself, a testament to the cruelty of the old psychiatric system and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable circumstances. As he worked, Marcus became increasingly absorbed in his photography, losing track of time as he sought the perfect angle for each shot. The light in the room was challenging, filtering through a single small window that was partially blocked by overgrown vegetation outside. He adjusted his camera settings, experimenting with different exposures to capture the full detail of the wall carvings. It was during one of these longer exposures that he first heard the sound, a soft scratching noise, like fingernails on wood, coming from somewhere behind him. Marcus turned quickly, his heart racing, but the room was empty. The sound had stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the normal creaking and settling noises of an old building. He waited for several minutes, listening intently, but heard nothing more. Probably just mice or rats, he told himself, or perhaps the building settling as the temperature changed. Old structures were full of such sounds, especially ones that had been abandoned for so long. Marcus returned to his photography but found it difficult to concentrate. The scratching sound had unsettled him more than he cared to admit, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as he worked. The room seemed to have grown darker, though he knew this was probably just clouds passing over the sun outside. He checked his camera's LCD screen to review his shots, and noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the last photograph he had taken, there was clearly a figure standing in the corner of the room behind him. The image was grainy and indistinct, but unmistakably human in shape. Marcus spun around, his camera ready, but the corner was empty. He looked back at the LCD screen, scrolling through his recent shots, but the figure appeared in only that one image. His hands trembling slightly, Marcus raised his camera and took another shot of the same corner. When he reviewed it, there was nothing there but shadows and peeling paint. He told himself it must have been a trick of the light, a combination of dust motes and shadows that had created the illusion of a human form. But deep down, he knew what he had seen, and it wasn't an illusion. The rational part of his mind fought against the growing sense of unease, providing logical explanations for everything he had experienced. The figure in his photograph could have been caused by camera shake during the long exposure, creating a blur that resembled a human silhouette. The scratching sound was almost certainly caused by small animals or the building's structural movement. The feeling of being watched was a common psychological response to being alone in a spooky environment, nothing more than his imagination running wild. But as Marcus continued to photograph the room, more anomalies began to appear in his images. Orbs of light that weren't visible to the naked eye, strange shadows that seemed to move between frames, and most disturbing of all, the recurring figure that appeared in roughly every 10th shot. The figure was always in a different location, sometimes in the background, sometimes partially obscured by furniture or shadows, but always there, always watching. Marcus's scientific mind struggled to find an explanation, running through every possible technical malfunction or environmental factor that could account for these images. Could there be a light leak in his camera body? Was there some kind of electromagnetic interference in the building affecting his equipment? He had been using the same camera for years without any problems, and he had photographed dozens of abandoned buildings without experiencing anything like this. The figure in his photographs was becoming clearer with each appearance, and Marcus began to make out details that chilled him to the bone. It appeared to be a man in what looked like hospital clothing, though the garments hung in tatters as if they had been torn or had simply rotted away over time. The face was gaunt and hollow-eyed, with skin that seemed to have a grayish pallor. Most disturbing were the hands, which appeared to be covered in dark stains, and ended in what looked like elongated fingernails or claws. As Marcus studied these images on his camera's small screen, he began to piece together a horrifying possibility. What if the stories about Dr. Voss and his experimental treatments were more than just local folklore? What if something had happened in this room? Something so traumatic that it had left an imprint on the very fabric of the building itself, The wall carvings took on a new significance as Marcus considered this possibility. Perhaps they weren't just the desperate scratchings of a disturbed patient, but something more, a record of experiments, or a warning, or perhaps even a map of some kind. He began to photograph the symbols more systematically, trying to document every mark and figure. The deeper he delved into his work, the more convinced he became that these carvings told a story, and that story was connected to the figure appearing in his photographs. The scratching sound returned, louder this time and clearly coming from within the walls themselves. Marcus pressed his ear against the plaster and could hear something moving inside the wall cavity, something too large to be a rodent. The sound had a rhythmic quality, almost like breathing, and occasionally there would be a pause followed by what sounded like whispered words in a language he didn't recognize. Marcus pulled out his phone and began recording audio, hoping to capture whatever was making these sounds. The recording revealed something even more disturbing than what he had heard with his naked ear. Beneath the scratching and breathing sounds, there were indeed voices, multiple voices speaking in what sounded like a mixture of languages. Some words were clearly English, others sounded German or perhaps Latin, and still others were in no language he had ever heard. The voices seemed to be having a conversation, though Marcus couldn't make out enough individual words to understand what they were discussing. One voice, however, was clearer than the others, and as Marcus listened to the recording through his headphones, he felt his blood turn to ice. The voice was speaking his name, not just once, but repeatedly, mixed in with other words he couldn't understand. Marcus rewound the recording and listened again, and there was no mistaking it. The voice was calling his name over and over with increasing urgency. This was beyond any rational explanation Marcus could conjure. Electronic voice phenomena, or EVP, was a well-documented if controversial field of paranormal research, but what he was experiencing went far beyond random sounds that might be interpreted as voices. This was direct communication, and it was specifically directed at him. Marcus began to question his own sanity. Was he having some kind of breakdown? Had the isolation and spooky atmosphere of the abandoned hospital triggered some kind of psychological episode? He tried to think back to his mental state over the past few weeks, looking for signs of stress or instability that might explain what he was experiencing. But he felt fine, better than fine actually. His work was going well, his relationship with Sarah was solid, and he had no history of mental illness in his family. The voices in the wall continued their whispered conversation, and Marcus found himself leaning closer, straining to make out individual words. He began to discern what sounded like instructions, directions of some kind, though he couldn't understand their purpose. The clearest voice, the one that had been calling his name, seemed to be leading the conversation, while the others responded in what sounded like agreement or acknowledgement. Marcus realized he was being drawn into something, pulled deeper into whatever mystery surrounded this room and this building. His photographer's instincts told him to document everything, to capture as much evidence as possible of this extraordinary experience. But another part of him, the rational part that had always kept him grounded, was screaming at him to leave, to get out of the building and never return. The figure in his photographs was becoming more active, appearing in nearly every shot now and seeming to move closer to the camera with each image. In the most recent photographs, Marcus could make out facial features with disturbing clarity. The eyes were dark and sunken but seemed to glow with an inner light. The mouth was open as if screaming or perhaps speaking, revealing teeth that appeared to be filed to points. Most disturbing was the expression on the face, which seemed to show a mixture of rage and desperate hunger. The scratching sounds from the walls had evolved into something more rhythmic, almost like knocking. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, repeating endlessly. Marcus recognized this pattern from his research into paranormal phenomena, though he had never given it much credence before. 3 knocks was supposedly a demonic signature, a mocking of the Christian Trinity. The irony wasn't lost on him that his skeptical, scientific worldview was being challenged by something that seemed straight out of a Hollywood horror movie. As the knocking continued, Marcus noticed that the carvings on the walls seemed to be changing. Not dramatically, but subtle shifts in the shadows made it appear as if the symbols were moving, rearranging themselves into new patterns. He blinked hard and looked again, but the effect persisted. The wall carvings were definitely changing, flowing like liquid text, forming new words and symbols even as he watched. Marcus raised his camera to document this phenomenon, but when he looked through the viewfinder, the walls appeared normal, static, unchanged. Only when he looked directly at them with his naked eye could he see the movement. This suggested that whatever was happening was occurring at a frequency or in a spectrum that his camera couldn't detect, or perhaps it was happening in his mind rather than in reality. But even as he considered this possibility, Marcus knew what he was seeing was real. The evidence was mounting that something supernatural was occurring in this room, something that defied all his previous beliefs about the nature of reality. The voices from the walls had grown louder, and Marcus could now make out complete sentences in English mixed with the foreign languages. They were talking about him, discussing his presence in the room as if he were a specimen to be studied. He heard references to his work, his life, even his relationship with Sarah, details that no earthly voice should have been able to know. The lead voice, the one that had been calling his name, began to speak directly to him. Marcus couldn't understand how he knew this, but somehow he was certain that the voice was addressing him personally, trying to communicate something important. He pressed his ear against the wall, straining to make out the words, and gradually began to piece together a horrifying message. The voice was telling him about Dr. Voss and the experiments that had been conducted in this very room. Not just medical experiments, but something far more sinister. Voss had been attempting to break down the barriers between the world of the living and the world of the dead, using his patients as unwilling subjects in rituals that blended pseudoscience with ancient occultism. The voice described procedures that sounded more like torture than medicine, designed not to heal but to traumatize the subjects so severely that their souls would be loosened from their bodies, making them vulnerable to possession or influence from other entities. Marcus felt sick as he listened to the descriptions of what had been done to the patients in this room. Men and women who had been committed for minor mental illnesses had been subjected to procedures that would have been considered crimes against humanity. They had been kept in isolation for months, subjected to sensory deprivation, forced to endure painful medical procedures without anesthesia, and exposed to psychological manipulation designed to break their minds completely. Many had died during these experiments, but according to the voice in the wall, death had not been an escape for them. Dr. Voss had been attempting to bind their souls to the physical location, trapping them in the building even after their bodies had perished. The voice explained that the wall carvings were not random scratchings, but a carefully constructed map of the spirit world, a guide to the territories that existed beyond death. Each symbol represented a different realm or entity, and together they formed a kind of instruction manual for traversing the boundary between life and death. The patients who had created these carvings had done so under the influence of the entities that Voss had been trying to contact, serving as conduits for information from the other side. As Marcus absorbed this information, he began to understand why he had been drawn to this place. The voices explained that the spirits trapped in the building had been waiting for someone like him, someone with the ability to document their story and share it with the world. His camera wasn't just recording images, it was capturing glimpses of the spirit world itself, providing evidence that consciousness survived death, and that the boundary between the living and the dead was not as solid as most people believed. But the voices also carried a warning. The longer Marcus remained in the room, the more vulnerable he became to the same forces that had claimed the patients decades ago. The spirits were grateful for his presence, but they were also desperate, and desperate entities were dangerous. They had been trapped for so long that they had begun to lose their individual identities, merging into a collective consciousness that was driven by a single overwhelming need, the need to escape their prison and return to the world of the living. Marcus felt a growing sense of urgency as he realized the true nature of his situation. He wasn't just a photographer documenting an abandoned building. He was a potential victim of the same forces that had claimed so many others before him. The figure in his photographs wasn't just appearing in his images, it was using his camera as a gateway, slowly manifesting in the physical world through the repeated exposure to his digital sensor. Each photograph was making it stronger, more real, more capable of affecting the physical world. The knocking from the walls had changed again, becoming more insistent and urgent. Marcus could hear other sounds now too, the creaking of floorboards from other parts of the building, the sound of doors opening and closing, and what sounded like footsteps in the corridor outside. The building was coming alive around him, awakening from its decades-long slumber as the spirits responded to his presence. Marcus knew he needed to leave, but found himself unable to move, not because of any supernatural force holding him in place, but because of his own fascination with what he was experiencing. This was the story of a lifetime, the kind of discovery that would revolutionize the fields of paranormal research and consciousness studies. His photographs provided the first concrete evidence of life after death, proof that human consciousness could survive the destruction of the physical body. How could he walk away from something so momentous? The rational part of his mind reminded him that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and that what he was experiencing could still be explained by psychological factors. Sleep deprivation, environmental toxins from the mold and decay in the building, electromagnetic fields from old wiring, all of these could potentially cause hallucinations and auditory phenomena. But as Marcus reviewed his photographs and audio recordings, he knew that what he had captured was real. The evidence was too consistent, too detailed, too specific to be dismissed as mere hallucination. The figure in his photographs was becoming clearer with each shot, and Marcus could now see that it wasn't just one entity, but several, overlapping and intermingled like multiple exposures on the same piece of film. The spirits of Dr. Voss's victims were all present, all trying to communicate their stories through his camera. Some appeared as they had in life, young men and women whose only crime had been mental illness or social nonconformity. Others had been transformed by their experiences, twisted into forms that reflected the trauma they had endured. The voice from the wall had grown silent, but Marcus could sense that the entities were still present, waiting and watching. The air in the room had grown thick and oppressive, making it difficult to breathe. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and Marcus could see his breath fogging in the cold air. These were classic signs of spiritual manifestation according to paranormal researchers. Though Marcus had always been skeptical of such claims, now he was experiencing them firsthand, and the reality was far more intense than any book or documentary had conveyed. Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of leaving the building as his survival instincts demanded, he decided to spend the night in room 237. He would document whatever happened during the hours of darkness, when spiritual activity was supposedly at its peak. This was his chance to capture definitive proof of life after death, evidence that would change the world's understanding of consciousness and existence. He set up his camera on a tripod and configured it for time-lapse photography, taking a shot every 30 seconds throughout the night. He also left his audio recorder running, hoping to capture more of the voices from the walls. As darkness fell, the building around him came alive with sound and movement. Footsteps echoed through the corridors, doors slammed in distant rooms, and the voices from the walls returned in full force, speaking in a mixture of languages and describing events that had occurred decades ago. Marcus sat in the corner of the room, his back against the wall, watching and listening as the spiritual world revealed itself to him. The figure in his photographs was no longer confined to the background, but appeared to be moving freely around the room, sometimes coming so close to the camera that it filled the entire frame. Through his viewfinder, Marcus could see details that chilled him to the bone. The entity wasn't just one of Voss's victims, but Voss himself, transformed by his own experiments into something inhuman and malevolent. The doctor's face was twisted with madness and hatred, his eyes glowing with an inner fire that spoke of knowledge that had driven him beyond the boundaries of sanity. The other figures in the photographs were indeed his victims, but they weren't the innocent spirits Marcus had initially assumed them to be. Decades of imprisonment had changed them, corrupted them, turned them into extensions of Voss's will. They had become his army of the damned, bound to serve him even in death, and they were growing stronger with each photograph Marcus took. As the night progressed, Marcus began to realize that he had made a terrible mistake. The spirits weren't grateful for his presence, they were feeding off it. His life force, his spiritual energy was being slowly drained away, used to strengthen their hold on the physical world. The photographs weren't just documenting their existence, they were providing them with a means of escape, a bridge between the world of the dead and the world of the living. Marcus tried to stop taking photographs but found that his camera was continuing to operate on its own, clicking away at regular intervals despite his attempts to turn it off. The time-lapse sequence he had started was beyond his control now, driven by forces that had taken command of his equipment. Each flash of the camera's strobe was like a beacon, calling to spirits throughout the building and drawing them to room 237. The voices from the walls were no longer speaking to him, but through him, using his vocal cords to communicate with each other in languages he didn't understand. Marcus could feel his consciousness being pushed aside, compressed into a small corner of his own mind while something else took control of his body. He was becoming a puppet, a vessel for entities that had been waiting decades for this opportunity. Through his possessed eyes, Marcus watched as his own hands began to carve new symbols into the walls, adding to the centuries-old map of the spirit world. His fingernails, which had somehow grown long and sharp, scraped against the plaster with the same sound he had heard earlier. He was becoming part of the wall carvings, his own story being added to the record of those who had been claimed by this cursed place. The time-lapse camera continued its relentless documentation, capturing his transformation from living human to spiritual entity. Marcus could see himself in the viewfinder, watching his own face change as the possession progressed. His eyes grew dark and hollow, his skin took on the grayish pallor he had seen in the other spirits, and his expression shifted from fear to a kind of twisted serenity as he accepted his fate. As dawn broke over the abandoned hospital, Marcus understood that he would never leave this room. He had become part of the building's dark history, another victim of Dr. Voss's experiments in bridging the gap between life and death. The photographs in his camera would be discovered eventually, when someone came looking for him, and they would serve as both evidence and warning to others who might be tempted to explore the building's secrets. The last image captured by the time-lapse sequence showed Marcus sitting motionless in the corner of the room, his camera bag at his feet, his eyes staring sightlessly at the wall carvings he had helped to create. To anyone who found the camera, it would appear that he had simply sat down and died, perhaps from a heart attack or stroke brought on by fear and exhaustion. They would never know that his consciousness was still trapped in that room, bound to serve Dr. Voss's malevolent spirit for eternity, waiting for the next photographer or urban explorer who would be drawn to document the mysteries of the abandoned Blackwood Psychiatric Hospital.